Hi, I'm glad to be here. So I would like to just acknowledge both Lori and Dennis, both of whom I've known for a really long time, and Deborah, and to say I'm thrilled to be here. I've been in Miami many, many times, but I don't know that I've ever given a talk here, so I'm thrilled to do it. So I wanted to, I decided to talk really about my curatorial practice because I think that's one of the things that's interesting and shows up well on slides. I am the CEO and director of the Aspen Art Museum, and really what I'm going to talk about today is some of what I've started to think about as kind of like a legacy at that museum. I've been there 13 years, and the kind of crowning achievement probably was the opening of a Shigeru Bon building there 4 years ago. A lot of the shows that I'm going to share with you tonight are actually in the old building, and so you'll get a sense of kind of what we were and what we are now. But Dennis talked about the first one-person museum exhibition, and that is something that I've done a lot throughout my career. And when I went to Aspen, decided to focus our program on three things. First, one-person museum exhibitions by an artist ever, or one-person exhibitions by an artist who's well-known but an under-known or under-recognized body of work, or a group exhibition on a salient topic in contemporary society. So I wanted to just take a minute and say about a year ago, I was asked to give a talk on the hero's journey using the Joseph Campbell model, and it gave me an opportunity to think about what it is that I do and why I do it. And through that process, learned about, if you don't know the story, it's like the story of every major Hollywood movie, from The Wizard of Oz to The Matrix, and you sort of set out on a journey, and there's a point at which you realize that you can't go back to who you were before. You burn the boats, and then you go on your path, and there are people that are your guides and your helpers, and I would put Dennis in that category, and there are people that also try and kind of take you down, take you out, try and convince you that what you want to do is a bad idea, and then you have a learning experience. So there's a process by which, if you're lucky, you learn something, you go through a transformation, and then you return back to your community as a changed person with that knowledge to share with other people. So I'm going to reference that a little bit as I give my talk, because there's a couple of projects in here today in my presentation that were part of that kind of learning and that transformation for me, to help me figure out what it is that I do. So what I do, and my life's mission, is to connect people to artists and art to make their lives better. So that's what I do. So this is the first project that I did at the Aspen Art Museum. It is a project with an artist named Yutaka Sone, a Japanese artist, and you can see him here wearing the blue puffy jacket, and that's me next to him, wearing the hats that we designed for the dice toss. And I knew that when you go somewhere new for a new job, you really only get like one chance to make a big statement. And so Yutaka had made these dice projects that he had thrown down the steps of the Sydney Opera House, out of a helicopter in the desert outside of San Antonio, Texas. And I thought, well, what's kind of the biggest thing we could do in Aspen? And so the Super Pipe, which is in the middle of Aspen Mountain, which is where they host the X Games, I thought, well, why don't we see if Yutaka can throw the dice down the Super Pipe at Buttermilk Mountain? I should say I came from the Berkeley Art Museum before, where like everything is regulated and like nothing is allowed. But Aspen truly is the Wild West, and I pitched it to the Aspen Skiing Company, and they're like, yeah, that sounds fun. And I was like, okay, great. Like, we're somewhere new. So made these dice. They're covered in something called P-Tech, which is what's on the bottom of skis. And I have to say there were some moments kind of leading up to it that we were worried about what kind of velocity they would go down the Super Pipe, and didn't want to take anyone out that was at the bottom or whatever. So we did have a very covert kind of test one night under cover of darkness, but without sort of spoiling it, we did do some kind of gambling, some betting to see what number they would come up. But they only made it about a third of the way down. And then all the people standing on the top. You also have up there David Zwerner, very famous gallerist, Stefan Edlis, famous collector, on their skis up there. So they got stuck about a third of the way down. All these kids started sliding down the super pipe and ripping the PTEX off and sliding down it like sleds. So it became this very community engaged activity, and that's actually one of the things we do at the Aspen Art Museum. Besides exhibitions, programs, publications, we do these immersive art activities. So on the left here, you see the dice. We put them back into the museum after they were thrown down. We kind of repaired them a little bit. And you can see some of his paintings, particularly the one on the left, which showed what he hoped the dice would do, some kind of curly cues and, a lot more velocity than we actually got. But that was kind of my welcome to Aspen. Okay. So this is a project that I would say was really a life-changing project for me, and this was the project that really convinced me of the idea that not only does art matter, but art really saves lives. So this is a Venezuelan artist named Javier Tellez. He grew up, both of his parents are psychiatrists, and his father would see patients in his office, which was really in their home, and the door would be open, and the patients would kind of move back and forth between the office and the house. And so he really grew up without any of the traditional stigma about mental illness. So all of his work involves people with different psychological challenges. So I had seen a project that he did based on the French Joan of Arc film, where he was also collaborating with women who were in a mental institution in Australia. And I previously worked at the Berkeley Art Museum and Film Archive, and I thought this is an amazing, amazing piece. I'd never heard of the artist, so I wanted to show it at the Berkeley Art Museum. Then I got the job in Aspen. He had a temporary studio, I think, in New York at the time. I went to go and see him and said, that work really doesn't make any sense in Aspen, but I loved it so much, I just wanted to come and meet you. And he said, you're moving to Colorado? And I said, yeah. And he said, well, I've always wanted to do a Western based on Oedipus Rex. I was like, okay. You gotta love artists, right? Anyway, we decided to make this Western. We found a kind of a halfway house in Grand Junction, which is about 2 hours outside of Aspen. And we drove down there and pitched the project to the members of this clubhouse. And a guy raised his hand and he said, I wrote a Western based on Oedipus Rex. And we were like, really? Okay, great. So the next morning, got an email, and there was a script, which was a Western based on Oedipus Rex. So it was written by this guy named Aaron Sheely. He had been in the graduate film program at USC. He had to drop out because he was manic depressive, and he stayed up that whole night and wrote the script. And that's actually Aaron Sheely playing Oedipus. So, and right before we started filming, Javier decided he wanted the characters to wear these Japanese no-masks. Okay, so Oedipus Rex, Western, Japanese no-masks, all of these kind of cultural clashes, one would think, but it was amazing. So we put together a film crew. Aspen's a funny place. There are a lot of people that end up there with a lot of different skill sets, and we were able to put together a whole film crew. And we filmed it at Ashcroft, which is a deserted ghost town outside of Aspen. No cell service, 40 to 50 degree temperature fluctuations during the day, cold coffee. We didn't ask anyone, why they were members of this clubhouse. Couple emergency room visits. Just like super hectic. I don't really think we knew what we were getting into. We had, about 15 people from this clubhouse come and stay in these hotels in Aspen. But we got the film made. And the woman who played Oedipus's mother was about a 55-year-old woman, maybe. We had Aaron Sheely and a couple other guys who were in their early 20s, one of whom was a cowboy, so he rode a horse in the film. Anyway, shot the film. Everyone went back to Grand Junction, and then we invited everyone to come back for a screening, and they came back up with their doctors. And we did the screening in the old museum, and at the end of the film, Javier decided right at the last minute to ask each character at the end of the film to just straight head on shot and to lift the mask. So as each character lifted their mask, you could see their face, you could see their eyes. It still like tears me up to think about it and talk about it. But after the screening at the museum, the doctor came up to me and said, you know, when they came back to Grand Junction, they were alive in a way they had never been before. So it's not just words when we say that, you know, art matters and art saves lives. It actually does, you know. And so that becomes part of a larger philosophy that I buy into, which is that, you know, art isn't a privilege, it's not a luxury, it's a basic human right. So when people say, you know, you support social services, you also support art because it has that purpose. So, totally different project, but a German artist named Nicole Wormers at the old museum. And this is just an opportunity. Sometimes I go and see a show or I do studio visit and I just think the work is different, has a different perspective, and I want to just kind of show the range of, you know, not just interactive work or video work, but also traditional sculpture. So this is an artist's first one-person museum exhibition, and someone who I think continues to do really great work today, but to kind of show the range. So it's amazing that this project is 10 years ago. So this is an artist named Lisa Ann Auerbach, and I wanted to do a project that would encourage people to vote. So totally nonpartisan, but just have your voice heard. So she knits, she makes all sorts of things, you know, with knitting machines, and we decided we would do this sweater project. So she did research into American political slogans, both Democratic and Republican, and they were not identified as which party they referenced. And honestly, there were two sweaters with the same slogan that once was a Democratic slogan and once was a Republican slogan. So, you know, it was just this idea that we wanted to kind of bring awareness to it. So we collaborated with different shops around Aspen, and these sweaters were in the windows of like 40 different shops around Aspen. But we also had a bunch of them at the museum, and if you would come and like leave your ID, you could check the sweater out and you could wear it around town. So it was really great because it was this project that brought awareness to you know, social engagement and, you know, participation, also with the sense of humor. And again, not didactic in any way, but just asking people to kind of show up and be part of a conversation that matters. Okay, so I already said that most of my career is based on kind of these one-person shows, and I have a friend named Peter Ely that I think gave a talk down here. He's a curator at MoMA PS1, and his career is based on group exhibitions. And we got into sort of a fight because he was kind of saying that group exhibitions are harder than solo exhibitions, and I was kind of like a cheater curator. So I was like, I don't really think so, but fine, I'll do a group exhibition to prove to you that, you know, I can also do one. So this is a show that I did, which was called Now You See It, and I love this show. So it was really about one of the things that I value most about art, which is like the opportunity for failure. And it's, you know, based on the idea that art is really hard because most of the time it doesn't work. You know, and so it's like great to be, I'm known as like the smiling curator or like the eternal optimist or whatever. So believe me, I'm not intending to be pessimistic in saying this. It's just realistic that most of the time art doesn't work. But when it does work, it's so amazing. You know, the aesthetic experience when you stand in front of a work of art and it transports you to a different time or place. You know, you forget where you were, what you were bothered by before you started looking at it. You know, sometimes it makes you cry. So when that happens, it's like an addictive experience, right? It hardly ever happens. But that's what we try and do. We try and set up these opportunities for that transcendent experience. Again, not in a didactic way, but just with the possibility. So this show was about the kind of inherent failure of art, but also the alchemical possibilities of art, how something goes from being nothing into something, and that when it does happen, how magnificent it is. So Rudolf Stingel work on the far right, a Felix Gonzalez Torres work, a Tom Friedman 2x4 that's painted to look like a 2x4, some Walid Beshti photograms, some Robert Ryman paintings, a Wade Guyton painting, and a Wolfgang Leib milkstone. So I said that we also do exhibitions by well-known artists, but in a kind of different way. So Fred Tomaselli is an artist that I've known really a long, long time, and have shown the work and been friends, I mean, since like the late 90s, I guess. And I really wanted to kind of recontextualize his work, because people would hear Fred Tomaselli's name and they would go, oh, he's the drug guy, right? He's the one that has work made out of drugs. And I was like, he hasn't been putting drugs in his work for a really long time. And even when he put the drugs in the work, that's not really what they were about. They were just like a medium. So any artist that uses a non-traditional medium, that's kind of what he was doing. So I invited him to do a solo show with us, and I suggested doing a kind of mid-career survey. And I said, I'd like to do a taxonomic read of your work, and I'd like to organize it into kind of traditional art historical categories: portraiture, landscape, still life, abstraction. And he's like, that's a terrible idea. And I said, well, will you just like think about it, And he's like, well, it's awful. Okay, but I'll think about it. So he thought about it, and he said, okay, I really don't think it's going to work, but like, fine. You invited me to do a show, go ahead and install it that way. So this show ended up traveling to the Tang Museum and the Brooklyn Museum. And one of my favorite stories about it traveling to the Brooklyn Museum was that the deputy director at the time said, well, why should we take your show? Like, we're so big and you're so small. And I said, well, we're your intellectual equals and you should take our show. So that's one of the things that we always sort of have done in Aspen, is like, kind of punched above our weight, with the idea that hopefully when we started to get people's attention, we would deserve it. So Fred tells that story all at the time about him telling me that it was a terrible idea, and he learned about his work by seeing it in these categories. And it wasn't just like a random idea that I had. He organizes all of the imagery that he puts into his work in that way as well. He has all these incredibly archived systems for his imagery, so it was based on what he was doing already. But he would do an exhibition and he would kind of mix everything together. So when he saw it separated, he started to make work based on understanding his own practice differently. And then also it frankly transformed the way that a broader audience thought about his work. So I felt really grateful to be able to contribute in that way. So we try and make art fun in Aspen also, try and have a kind of sense of humor about it. So there I am in the white dress and the blue hat again. You can see my changing hairstyles over time. But the old-fashioned 4th of July parade is a big deal in Aspen. Like, everyone comes, and so a big part of what we've worked on in Aspen is to try and bring art to the public in new and unexpected ways, and then maybe get people interested. So to try and kind of spark some curiosity. So people go to the old-fashioned 4th of July parade mostly to collect candy and like see each other. But we thought if we commission artists to make work that's truly art, that gets put in front of people who are really not looking for it, that maybe they will enjoy it. So this is a Dave McKenzie project. That is Dave. And Dave is the inflatable, but there is also Dave standing in front of the inflatable Dave, walking along. And kind of an embarrassing story for Aspen, but as we were walking along, people, more than one, said, "Is that Barack Obama?" And I was like, "Barack Obama? What?" So anyway, so okay, so I have another art world friend, Michael Govan, who's the director of the LA County Museum of Art, and he is a close kind of collaborator and someone I admire a lot. And he told me some years ago that no one writes a curator's history if a curator doesn't write their own history. And so to be kind of mindful of that and to think about, which artists you are really intending to be aligned with. Who are you going to work with over years, and empower and advocate for. And so one of my artists is Mark Monders. So I've done a couple different projects with Mark Monders, and mostly I work with Mark Monders because I really don't know what his work is about. And I think it's amazing, but I don't really know why. And I first saw his work at a Documenta exhibition many years ago, and I didn't like it at all. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. And so I thought, well, what a great opportunity as a curator to spend, a year or more of my time to look at an artist's work that I don't understand and to try and figure it out. So we did an exhibition together at the Berkeley Art Museum, and I really still didn't understand the work. And then I went and did a studio visit. He has a factory right kind of on the Dutch-Belgian border, and it was the longest studio visit I've ever done. If I'm going to visit you in the next couple of days, please do not expect this. But I showed up in the morning, had breakfast, went to the studio, had lunch, had a nap on the couch, was woken up by his son, had dinner with his family, went back to the studio, and I think I was there like 16 hours. But when we did this exhibition, it traveled to the Walker Art Center and the Hammer Museum of Art and the Dallas Museum of Art, and my contribution to the catalog was basically like a field guide to the work of Mark Monders. So I went through and picked out repetitive circumstances or imagery or language, and then did a description of it. So I think I understand what the work is about now, but I love the idea of how complicated it is and how committed he is to the practice. So just to tell you one thing about it, all of the sculptures that you see here are made by an alter ego of Mark Monders, whose name is spelled in all capital letters, okay? And it's all for a project that's called Self-Portrait as a Building. So get the book, it's good. So this is an artist named Heidi Yang, and we have had an artist in residence program, and one of the things that we did when I came to Aspen was we didn't want to be a museum and a destination. We wanted to be a destination museum. And so we thought part of how we could do that is not traveling a lot of our shows. We travel some of our shows. I mentioned a few, but the idea is that if you want to see them, you have to come to Aspen. And then we also commission a lot of the work that we show. So Hegu was in residence, and all the work that you see she made specifically for us, and it was made kind of on site. And another artist who has a really complicated practice, but interesting use of kind of found materials and creative sort of repetitive processes. So the images that you see on the right here, for example, are all from letters that she gets. So those are all the insides of envelopes. And then the pyramid of gold that you see in the back, she hand knitted all of those cozies, and inside of each block is spam. So that's like a gold cozied spam pyramid. So we, for about 12 years, were partners with the Aspen Skiing Company. When I first came to Aspen, I saw people walking around with these lift tickets hanging off their jackets, and it was just like a generic mountain landscape. And I thought, well, there isn't really anything about Aspen that's generic. So why don't we commission artists and put their images on the lift ticket? So we did that for 12 years up until this last year. But one of the artists that we had done that with is Mark Grosjean. And Mark, I thought, would put, and Mark's one of my artists too, that I've shown a bunch of times. And so I thought that Mark would want to put his paintings on the lift tickets, but instead he wanted to put these sculptures. But no one had ever seen these sculptures before, but he was making them. So he just, came up with not one lift ticket, but 4 lift tickets, or 5 actually, 5 lift tickets, and these sculptures. So there was some back and forth with the ski company because it did not meet expectations. But and he never has let me live that down to this day. But we also were able to put each of the sculptures that eventually were featured on the lift tickets at the top of the 4 ski mountains and then one in front of the old museum. So it was a way also of really, again, putting art in unexpected places, in unexpected ways, and encouraging people to have this kind of blend of the landscape and the institutional structure of the museum. So, and there were these beautiful places. So, and this was the exhibition. So it was an exhibition, it was the first one-person museum exhibition of Marc Grosjean's work. So, and it was a survey of his paintings. So when we had the opportunity to build the Aspen Art Museum, we were able to acquire a piece of land in downtown Aspen. I don't think it's probably easy to build anything anywhere. Aspen is certainly not the exception to that rule. So very hard, took a long time. But we wanted to let people know that it was, you know, not another condo or something, that it was going to be an art museum. So we commissioned a couple of artists to actually do projects on the scaffolding around the museum. So this is a Kay Rosen project. And so on one side it said, you know, keep out. On the other side it said peek in. And people thought it was sort of unfriendly, but you know, that wasn't the idea. I mean, if you know anything about Kay Rosen's work, it's, you know, there are these kind of literary puns, right? So keep backwards is peek, right? So, and then the idea of out and in. And she did use orange and white, sort of like the construction colors, you know, the traditional way of getting people's attention. But I sort of forgot about this project because after this project came down, we put a Dave Muller project there, and Dave's another one of my artists, and I actually live with part of that project. So when I was putting together this talk, and someone asked me like, "Oh, have you given this talk?" So it's like your standard talk, and I said, "No, I've never given this talk. I'm not actually even sure what I'm going to say." But you know, when I was thinking about like the legacy of exhibitions that I've done, I thought of this project, and it's one that I was really proud of. So artists that, again, well known, Lorna Simpson's been showing work for, I don't know, 30 years, maybe 35 years, right after she graduated from Yale. But she had never had an exhibition of her drawings. And so I invited her to come and be in residence in Aspen, and asked if I could do an exhibition of her drawing practice. So this was the first exhibition to survey her drawings, and we did a massive book on it as well. So these images, there were a few men, but they're mostly women. Mostly you can't see their faces. If you can see their faces at all, it's kind of a generic profile. And the idea is, you know, who's being represented and how are they being identified? And in this book, I actually wrote an essay on the importance of black hair, or hair for black women. And so here, the hair is represented in this super luscious, like gold, expressionistic, painterly application. And so it's a way of expressing that people can be identified through different ways, and it doesn't always have to be just right from the front. So this is an artist that you may never have heard of, but this is one of the artists who I would say defined my aesthetic interest over time. So this is an artist who was represented by a gallery called Stuck's Gallery, originally in Boston and then in New York. And I was briefly the slide archivist at Stuck's Gallery when I was like 20 years old. And this show was on view in like 1991 or something. And I had never heard of Charles Eames. I mean, obviously I had sat on chairs like that before, like in the doctor's office or, you know, in like a train station or something like that, right? Because they were like these mass-produced objects. But I didn't know anything about design, contemporary design, and I had never seen art that took a form like this. So it completely like tweaked my mind that art could be made out of these, generic and like intentionally made grosser chairs. So every single thing that you see about them, she, added. So the dirt, the duct tape, the missing legs, and the Grateful Dead sticker. I mean, this show just blew my mind, and I never really stopped thinking about it. So Hope Quintel had a really successful career before this in Boston, and she was a painter. And then she did this exhibition, maybe it was 1993. Anyway, it was somewhere around there. And the press hated it, like completely trashed her. So she had gone from being kind of like an art darling to like, every single review was like so mean. And Stefan didn't sell any of the works from the show. Right after that review, she disappeared and she became a hermit. She literally, outed herself from the world. And I never forgot about her, and sometimes like when I couldn't sleep at night and I would like Google around for stuff, I would look for her. And for years I never found anything. And then, one time, a few years ago, I found some like tennis membership at the YMCA in Chicago, okay? So, and I was like, how did I find that? Anyway, through a series of different events, and then a studio visit with Vic Muniz, who is a really good friend of Holt Quintel's, I got sort of reconnected with her. And she really is a recluse, but I was able to organize this show. I mean, and she said yes to the show, and then a couple times she tried to kind of back away from it. But, she still owns most of these works, and they were in a storage unit in Chicago. Meanwhile, there's so much lore about her. I'm pretty sure that she is a very successful hedge funder in London. But before she was this art star, she was also like a concert pianist who performed at Carnegie Hall, and before that she was like a junior tennis champion. Okay, so like this amazing, amazing person. And when I did this show, so I found out funny things like Takashi Murakami is one of the biggest collectors of her work. And so there are these, kind of random things about her, but when I did this show a few years ago, people thought it was work that had just been made, but it was all from like, 90, 91, 92. So that's one of the other things that, we try and do, or I try and do, is to go back and like reconstruct things that are part of my memory and my history and my interest for like, another generation and to see, what happens with those threads. So people went crazy for the work. They wanted her to be in the last Documenta. People have been asking me to put them in touch, but I mean, she really, I never even got to see her. My registrar got to go to Chicago and, see her and condition report all the objects, but she wouldn't let him take a picture or anything like that. So it's a real thing. So the last show that we did in the old building at the Aspen Art Museum was this Ernesto Neto show, and I thought it was so amazing that he titled the show Gratitude. And he's another one of my artists. I showed at the Berkeley Art Museum. I showed in Aspen. We have another project that we're working on together coming up. And we kept the old museum open once we opened the new museum. We never closed. We never stopped operations, and we actually overlapped operations for about 2 months. I really wanted, just like I started with a bang, I really wanted to end the old building with a bang. And that building was great to us for a long time, 34, 36 years, something like that. So Ernesto came to Aspen, and he paced around. I should tell a story that before I came to Aspen, I was at the Berkeley Art Museum, and one of the things that I learned how to do there was raise money. And one of the ways that I thought of to raise money was to start, now people do this all the time, but it was kind of a new idea at the time, but to start this program where we would invite artists to a collector's home, and we would have a dinner, and we would have them talk about their work, okay? Just wasn't happening at the time. So Ernesto was So Peter Doig, I did Peter Doig's first American Museum exhibition. He came, he had just gotten off a plane. You know, he had kind of a lot to drink. It was sort of hard to understand him, but it was like, okay, he just got off a plane. Okay, but Ernesto, because we would do the talks during dessert. Okay, so then Ernesto came. We had dinner, very conservative San Francisco woman's home. And, you know, during dessert, he's giving his talk. He's swearing in like 4 different languages, you know. I mean, he's pacing back and forth. He's like pulling on his hair. After that, when we had the conversations during cocktails. So, but when you work with Ernesto, it's very, you know, everyone gets involved. It's super participatory. It's, you know, very organic. And he had decided what he wanted to do on the lower level of the museum. It was a 2-story museum. And this is what we did on the lower level. But he wasn't sure what he wanted to do upstairs. And we had our whole team, registrars, curators, installers, prep crew. And he laid down on the ground. So then I laid down on the ground. And then everyone just laid down on the ground. And we were just quiet because he was thinking. And our CFO came up the stairs, and she saw everyone laying on the ground. And she was like, what happened? She thought there was like some kind of, you know, carbon monoxide issue or something like that. But laying on the ground became super important for the show, and that's what this is about. So the idea here, these were all individual beds. So people would lay down on these beds, and then these were these weighted circumstances forms, and you would release them, and then this would come down. And so these little forms here, which were like stockings with different stones in them, would land on different chakras of your body. So it was like this healing experience. And so they were individual ones, but that was a group one. And then these were ones that you could stand in. So you needed kind of 2 people, and you would release this form, and then it would come down on top of you. So it was like these healing apparatuses, which would put these stones that he had washed in the river by the museum on these different chakras of your body. So these were some of the individual beds. And it felt good, and it smelled really good also. Like he had different smells in them, you know, also. So different ways of, you know, engaging with art. So when we opened the new museum, which seemed like an impossible project, I wanted to do some exhibitions that also seemed impossible. So a few years before we even knew that we could do the new museum, I approached one of our donors, who's one of the largest private collectors of Yves Klein works. And I said, if we open the new museum, if we actually can get it done, will you lend me your Yves Kleins, because I'd like to do an Yves Klein David Hammond show. And she said, absolutely. So then I had to get David Hammond's on board, which is like a whole nother story. But so this is that show. So it paired 3 different bodies of work by each of the artists, actually 4, in these kind of surprising ways. So there are some David Hammond's basketball drawings on the left, an Yves Klein rain piece, and then some an Yves Klein fire piece, and then a David Hammond's body print. So it was looking at the basketball drawings with the fire prints, the body prints with the anthropometries, and then the Klein monochromes with the David Hammond's Kool-Aid works, and then, you know, some performative works that they both did. So 2 of my favorite artists, and I always wanted to do a show of them together, and I really wasn't sure what the show was about until pretty close to when it opened, but I knew that there was a really good idea there. It just was really hard to kind of tease it out and figure out what it was. So here you see the body prints with the anthropometry. So beautiful. So when we opened the museum, I wanted to try and do as many different types of exhibitions as possible, so that when we open, no one could say like, oh, they only do this or they don't do that. So one of the other projects that we commissioned was this Sai Gao Chang Black Lightning piece. And I had done a project with Sai at the Berkeley Art Museum. And And actually one of my favorite works of all time is one of his pieces called The Cultural Melting Pot, and it's on Naoshima Island in Japan. It sits right on the Sea of Japan, and it's a hot tub with these Japanese scholars, life-size Japanese scholars, rocks around it, and it has these like aromatherapy, like tinctures or whatever in it. So the idea is, you enter the hot tub with people from different cultures and like you commune, right? So it sits on the Sea of Japan. It's one of the most beautiful places I've ever seen. And I always kind of not joke that if things ever go really bad for me and I disappear, like you'll find me there. So when we opened the museum, I asked him if we could put the Cultural Melting Pot, if we could borrow it and put it up on the roof deck of the museum. And he said, you know what, I've done that before. I'd like to do something different and new. And I've always wanted to do an explosion event with black lightning. So very difficult to do, but we were able to figure out how to do it. So you see it here, and I have a video.
Tequila. Ready?
So we try and bring the outside in and the inside out, as much as we can as well. So this was a project with a Mexican artist named Gabriel Corey. When I got to Aspen, we started the Aspen Art Press, so we've published a lot of books, and he was our artist in residence, and he wanted to actually use the funds not to produce new work, but to produce a major book. So we were able to do that with him as well. But some of my favorite works are these tapestry works that you see on the wall, and he collects receipts as he travels, and then he works with Mexican weavers to create these weavings out of the receipts. So it's a way of looking at the transactional nature of our lives and where we go and what kind of footprint we leave based on what we acquire, from whom and where. So this is the other part of his exhibition. So Roberto Cuoghi is an Italian artist. We collaborate periodically with the consortium in Dijon, France, and so we did this exhibition together as well. He is a really unusual artist. The first work of his I experienced was a sound piece, and he was interested in Etruscan music, which obviously there's no recording of. So he imagined what he thought Etruscan music would sound like, and then he made the instruments that he thought they would need to make those sounds, and then he played them, and then he recorded the music, and then he destroyed the instruments, and he presented the sound. So I love that kind of multi-step process of creativity. So this is a project based on Pazuzu, which is like which a lot of people, I guess, carry around the image of Pazuzu as like an amulet to kind of, protect you. So a contemporary version of that would, and so this is based on a Pazuzu amulet that's in the collection of the Louvre in Paris. And so he got the curators there to get him entry, and he spent time, photographing it and drawing it. And then he made these sort of life-size sculptures that activated or enhanced different aspects of that Pazuzian imagery. And he talked about like a contemporary version of that would be whatever sort of superstition you have to kind of protect yourself or those that you love from harm. So, like a rabbit's foot, right, would be like a 70s kind of thing, or like, throwing salt over your shoulder. So this whole show was about superstition and how, living in increasingly like quixotic times, what do we do to try and minimize our angst and anxiety? And so that's what this exhibition was about. So these are all Pazuzian sculptures, and he does not share what they're made of, what their materiality is, but he's sort of like a mad scientist, and he's always combining different materials and chemicals and ways to make these forms both intentionally and unintentionally. So they seem very like active, as if they're still kind of evolving or disintegrating, in front of you. So I do like to go back, in history also, not just like to the 90s, but this is an artist named Alan Shields, who at the time was the artist that really kind of financed through his sales of his work, Paula Cooper's gallery. But probably most people, haven't heard of him. He died in early death. He was a smoker. So he died of lung cancer, and actually he was also a ferry operator on the Shelter Island ferry. So he was also like sucking the exhaust, the smoke from the ferries too. So, and I had never heard of him or seen the work. He was popular, really, really popular in the 80s. But there was one of his works is in the collection. His work is in museum collections, but one is in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art in New York. It hadn't been on view in 25 years, and Laura Hopman pulled one out. And a friend of mine who works there texted me and said, "You got to go see this Alan Shields painting in the collections gallery. It's totally your thing." I fell in love with the painting and started to do some research into his work, and was able to do the first survey of his work in a long time, and put together a major book, and work with his kids, and kind of hopefully breathe a little more air back into someone who clearly was really incredible artist. And one of the things that I liked about him is that he had no kind of delineation between his art and his life. So he was a Buddhist practitioner. He was a fisherman. So, you can see this is a beaded work on the wall on the left of the image, but it looks very much like a fishing net. So there was just kind of a harmonious integration of his spiritual practice and his means of supporting himself and his family and his art practice that I found to be really inspiring and sort of hopeful for our time. He made these kind of totem poles, very, very thin, but you can see two on the right and two on the left, and all of their titles were based on Buddhist koans, like unsolvable questions. And I feel like that's a great kind of key to art, right? So asking questions that actually have no answer, but not to like stump people, but just to kind of encourage you to participate in that questioning for self-exploration's sake, right? So to kind of celebrate the process rather than seeking the end product or the result. And we actually do a program at the museum that's called I Don't Get It, because, you know, that's the whole thing, right? Like there is no it to get. That's like the secret to art, you know? So recently did this exhibition of Julian Schnabel's plate paintings. This is the first exhibition of his plate paintings in 40 years. And it's the first time ever that the first 4 plate paintings that he made were ever shown together. Because the second one that he made was immediately bought by the Des Moines Art Center. And I was not around when Julian Schnabel was, you know, like a major art star. And a few years ago, I was walking around Chelsea, and I ran into someone, and they said, you know, what's the best thing you saw today, right? Which is what people ask all the time. And I said, this is so weird, but it was actually these Julian Schnabel purple paintings from the 90s. And they were like, yeah, that was the best thing I saw too. I was like, what, you know, what is that? So I'm friends with Julian's son, and he'd been trying forever to get me to come over to the studio. And so I went to the studio, and at first I wanted to show those purple paintings because I thought they were really good. But then I thought, you know, if you're going to do a Julian Schnabel show, and like most people like of my generation like have never seen really probably met, you know, much of his work, you can't just show these purple paintings from the 90s. They're too easy and too pretty. So I decided to do this plate painting show. And I mean, I honestly, and Julian knows this, I'm not like speaking out of school, like I don't think these paintings are really beautiful, you know? They're not necessarily even something that, you know, it's really my taste. But that's kind of the idea, right? Is that, you know, if you put together an ambitious program and a rigorous and tough program, it's not because it's your taste, you know? So that's a mistake that people make. Sometimes, you know, they think it's like, you know, what I like. And it's like, no, it's not what I like, you know? It's what I think is important to be seen. So this was a really, really important show. And it was so great working on it with Julian. And he came into the galleries and saw those first 4 plate paintings together, and he like kind of cried, you know, because it was so moving to see something that he hadn't seen in such a long time. So, and these, you know, these are big, big paintings. I mean, some of them are 12 feet wide, 14 feet wide, and they're super heavy. And again, they feel very, very timely, but they were, you know, from 30, 40 years ago. So this is the first plate painting that he ever made on the left, and the one on the right is the second plate painting that he ever made. So I'm sorry, this is the third one, and this is the fourth one. So, and you can see how they start to change. The first one just had it as sort of like the form of a closet, because he had the idea to make these paintings when he was in Italy. So the form that comes off the front was the size and shape of the closet in his hotel room in Italy. And then he started to create like a plinth across the top. So this is 3. And then they were white, the first ones. And then this is the fourth one where he started to have the green color to them. And they often reference biblical topics or, you know, circumstances where, you know, someone's like struggling to be understood. So I talked about the Eve Klein David Hammond show. So this is a show we did last summer. Okay, almost done. Okay, thank you, good. So show that we did last summer of Wade Guyton and Peter Fishley and David Weiss. They collaborated together on these sculptures, which look a lot like walls, but they're actually sculptures. But they, when we built the Aspen Art Museum, there were a lot of things that people thought they wouldn't like about it, and then people ended up liking it. And then what they ended up doing with these sculptures was trying to kind of block things that then people liked, so that people would be happy when the show was over and they could have the museum back. So this sculpture here, this wall that's around the front, is one of the collaborative sculptures of Wade Guyton and Peter Fischley. Okay, so this is two more of the wall sculptures, the one on the back and the one on the right. This is a Wade Guyton X painting, which was hung outside, and a Fischley Weiss landscape sculpture, which was made on site. So Wade wanted to put the painting outside. He said it was my idea. I don't think it was, but anyway, it was. It got rained on, it got snowed on, and it totally survived. And it was kind of great because he said, if the walls are going outside, right, then the art has to go outside as well. So this is a gallery of Wade's New York Times paintings and the travel photographs of Fischley Weiss. So that was about how we get information and how it's communicated. This is another one of the wall sculptures you can see in the center. So these are the fiberglass pieces of Fischley Weiss, and then a Wade Guyton painting in the back. And they wanted it to look like the museum was under construction and that the show hadn't been installed yet. So it was kind of playing with that notion of, sometimes you can't tell when it's art, and sometimes, that's intentional. So Rat and Bear, and then it's one of my favorite artworks of all time. It's they breathe. So as you stand with them, you can see their chests going up and down. So it's incredibly poetic. So we restaged this, the first exhibition that Robert Gober ever curated, and it was done originally at the ICA in Boston. And so we redid it with this work by Meg Webster in the middle, Robert Gober in the door frame and the door in the back, and then this Bierstadt painting, so which we were able to borrow from the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. This is the last work, and this is a show that's up right now. Cheryl Donegan is an artist who was well known in the 90s, and she was actually in my master's thesis, but I never met her. And when Wade Guyton was in Aspen, he asked me if I would go and visit Cheryl Donegan's studio. He said she's making these really incredible paintings. So I went to her studio. I thought the paintings were amazing, but I also saw these dresses and these fashion works, and it turns out she's really interested in fashion. But for many years, she didn't think she could be a painter and also like fashion. So we have this exhibition of her paintings. It's traveling to the Contemporary Art Museum in Houston, but we also commissioned this fashion line from her. So they are incredible. There's some upcycled ones, and then there are the standard collection, which you can just get in the bookstore. And so you can see the paintings, and then I'll just end with, we did a fashion show.
Brush the brows, and then just shush the hair, okay? And then we're good. Okay.